What if the Vikings had conquered England permanently? What if England had never become England at all? What if the language you're listening to right now sounded less like German with a French paint job and more like Danish? What if the crown that sits in the Tower of London traced its line not to William the Conqueror, not to Alfred the Great, but to a Viking warlord who was baptized with a fake name and a real sword still on his hip? Because here's the thing people forget when they talk about Vikings in England. We treat the whole affair like a smash and grab. Longships show up, monasteries burn, some guys in horned helmets that never actually existed steal some silver, and then eventually, good King Alfred chases them off and England gets to be England. That is the story on the poster. It is also almost a coin flip away from being completely wrong. So Jimmy, quick history refresher before we break it. In 793, Norse raiders hit the monastery at Lindisfarne, and that date basically gets remembered as the opening shot of the Viking Age in Britain. For decades after that, it stays what it looks like, raiding. Smash, grab, sail home. But in 865, something changes. A force chroniclers call the Great Heathen Army lands in East Anglia, and this is not a raid anymore. This is an invasion with intent to stay. Within a few years, Northumbria falls, East Anglia falls, Mercia gets carved up. By 878, of the four old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, only Wessex is still standing, and Wessex is standing on one leg. The King of Wessex, at that moment, is a guy named Alfred, and if you've heard one Viking-era English story, it's probably this one. In early 878, a Danish king named Guthrum launches a surprise midwinter attack and very nearly finishes Alfred off completely. Alfred doesn't die. He retreats into the marshes of Somerset into a place called Athelney, and for a few months, the King of Wessex is basically a guy hiding in a swamp with whatever soldiers he can scrape together. This is the actual historical low point of Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred is not commanding an army from a castle, he is hiding. Then in May of 878, Alfred pulls together the local levies of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire, and he meets Guthrum's army at a place called Edington. And he wins, decisively. Guthrum's force is broken and Guthrum himself retreats to a fort where Alfred besieges him until he surrenders. Here's the part that matters for us. Guthrum doesn't just surrender militarily. He agrees to be baptized with Alfred himself standing as his godfather, and the two of them carve up the map with something called the Treaty of Wedmore. Wessex stays Anglo-Saxon and independent. Everything roughly northeast of a line running from London up to Chester becomes what we now call the Danelaw. Under Norse rule, Norse law, Norse settlement. From that one battle, everything else follows. Alfred's descendants spend the next 2 generations pushing back into the Danelaw. His son, Edward the Elder, expands it. His grandson, Athelstan, finishes the job, and in 927, Athelstan becomes the first king who can plausibly call himself King of all the English, not King of Wessex, not King of Mercia, King of England. As a single idea, for the first time in history, everything you think of as English identity, arguably, is downstream of one army holding one line in a swamp in Somerset in 878. Now, there is a wrinkle later. In 1016, a Danish king named Canute actually does conquer the whole of England and rules it as part of a North Sea empire alongside Denmark and Norway. So don't let anyone tell you Norse England never happened. It did happen. It just didn't stick. Cnute's empire falls apart within a decade of his death because it was built on personal loyalty to one very capable king rather than any lasting institution, and by 1042, the Anglo-Saxon line is back on the throne with Edward the Confessor. And you know what happens after Edward the Confessor? 1066. Harold Godwinson beats one Norse invasion at Stamford Bridge in the north, marches his exhausted army 400 kilometers south in about 2 weeks, and loses everything to William of Normandy at Hastings. England ends up ruled by French-speaking Normans instead of Norse-speaking Danes, which if you think about it is almost a cruel joke, because the Normans were Vikings too, just Vikings who who'd been sitting in northern France for 150 years, picking up French fashion and French law and forgetting how to row. So here's our divergence point, and I want to be precise about it because there are about 4 places in this story where a coin could have landed the other way. We're not doing Stamford Bridge, we're not doing Hastings, we're going back to the actual hinge, May of 878, Edington. What if Alfred doesn't win? It is not a stretch. Alfred at that point in the war has an army built from 3 counties worth of farmers and thegns called up on short notice, facing a force that had already broken 3 of the 4 English kingdoms. If Guthrum reads the ground a little better, if the English levies arrive a day late, if Alfred himself goes down in the melee the way Harold does 2 centuries later at Hastings, Wessex does not recover. There is no Athelney comeback story. There is no Treaty of Wedmore as a negotiated peace between equals because there are no equals left. Guthrum simply takes Wessex the way the Great Heathen Army took Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia before it. And that's it. That's the whole ballgame. There is no 4th kingdom left standing to be the seed of a future England. There is no Alfred to become the character English school children learn about burning cakes and founding a navy. There is no Athelstan 2 generations later unifying an English nation, because there is no English nation left to unify. What there is by roughly 880 is Norse rule over the entire island of Britain south of the Scottish frontier, uncontested. Let's sit with what that actually means, because I think people underestimate how total this would be. Alfred wasn't just a battlefield commander. Alfred is the reason Old English survives as a literary and administrative language at all. He personally commissioned translations of Latin texts into English, specifically because he was worried the whole culture of literacy was collapsing under the pressure of Viking wars. He built a network of fortified towns called burhs specifically to make future Viking conquest of Wessex logistically impossible. Every single one of those projects requires Alfred to still be king in 879. Take him out, and you don't just lose a king, you lose the institution that was actively trying to preserve English identity as something separate from Norse identity. So what fills the vacuum? A single Norse-ruled kingdom of all Britain, under Guthrum first, and then whoever his successors turn out to be. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because a Norse England that wins outright in 880 is playing with about a century and a half more time than the Danelaw ever got historically. That's a century and a half for Norse institutions to stop being an occupying garrison and start being simply how the country runs. Language first, because language is the fingerprint that survives everything else. In our timeline, Old Norse leaves English with an enormous vocabulary: sky, window, knife, husband, law, they, them, their, egg, take, cut, die, words so basic you'd assume they were native. That's the residue of a couple hundred years of Norse settlement getting slowly absorbed into a dominant Anglo-Saxon culture. Now flip the power balance. Instead of Norse vocabulary getting absorbed into English, Old English gets absorbed into Norse. The language that ends up being spoken on this island a few centuries later isn't West Germanic with a heavy North Germanic accent, the way real English actually is. It's the other way around. It's a North Germanic language structurally closer to what became Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, carrying some Old English loanwords for local geography and old institutions the way English kept some Celtic river names. If you travel to this alternate London in the year 1200 and someone spoke to you in the street, you would probably get further understanding them if you spoke modern Danish than if you spoke modern English. Law is the second big fingerprint, and this one might be even bigger than language. Norse political culture across Scandinavia and Norse settlements ran on something called the Thing, an assembly of free men who met to settle disputes, make laws, and in places like Iceland, run the entire country without a king at all. The historical Danelaw region of England actually kept versions of this. It's called the wapentake system, and traces of it survive in England's county administrative structure to this day, of all things. In our timeline, that Norse legal culture gets steadily absorbed and reshaped by Anglo-Saxon kingship and then Norman feudalism until it becomes just one flavouring ingredient in English common law. In this alternate timeline, with Norse rule uncontested and permanent from 880 onward, the Thing Assembly doesn't get diluted into a footnote. It becomes the actual operating system of English governance for centuries, the way it did in Iceland and parts of Scandinavia. You could genuinely end up with a Kingdom of Britain where the king's power is constitutionally checked by regional assemblies centuries before anyone in our timeline sits down to argue about Magna Carta, because the whole legal culture never went through the Norman feudalization that concentrated power in the crown and the great barons in the first place. Religion is the third fingerprint, and it's messier than people expect. Guthrum did convert to Christianity historically as part of losing to Alfred, and that's important because it tells us Norse rulers in England were entirely capable of accepting Christianity when it served their political interests. A Norse England that wins outright doesn't necessarily stay pagan for centuries. Guthrum's conversion in our own timeline happened for exactly the pragmatic reason a victorious Guthrum would still have. In this scenario, it's a lot easier to rule a population of Christian farmers and Christian monasteries if you're not actively at war with their god. So I'd actually argue Christianity still wins here, but on a different schedule and through a different door. Instead of arriving through Anglo-Saxon kings, converting from the top down, starting in the 6th and 7th centuries, it arrives through a Norse aristocracy, converting from pragmatism in the 9th and 10th centuries, decades or generations after the historical timeline, and syncretized much harder with Norse practice on the way in. You'd likely see a much longer overlap period where local courts are Christian in name, but still swear oaths on Thor's hammer, the way parts of actual Viking Age Scandinavia did for generations after their kings officially converted. Now let's follow the political thread forward, because this is where 1066 stops being a thing that can even happen. The Norman Conquest exists historically because of an extremely specific chain of dynastic accidents. Edward the Confessor was half Norman by his mother, spent his exile in Normandy, had no children, and left a succession vacuum that William of Normandy, Harold Godwinson, and Harold Hardrada all had competing claims to. None of that dynasty exists in this timeline. There is no House of Wessex to run out of heirs, because the House of Wessex never gets past 880. There is no Edward the Confessor with Norman family ties, because there's no Anglo-Saxon monarchy left for a Norman-raised claimant to inherit into. William of Normandy has no plausible legal claim to invade, because the entire premise of his claim was a promise made by an English king to visit family. Without that king, there's no promise, and without the promise, the Norman Conquest simply doesn't happen. Britain in the 11th century is Norse, has been Norse for 200 years, and Norman Normandy across the Channel is just one more North Sea neighbour among Denmark, Norway, and whoever's currently sitting on the English throne. Which raises an even bigger question. If there's no Norman Conquest, England never gets pulled into French dynastic politics the way it historically was. Remember, the 100 Years' War happens because English kings descended from Norman and then Plantagenet lines hold territory in France and eventually claim the French throne itself, rip the Normans out of English history entirely, and there's no English claim to French land, no Angevin Empire straddling the Channel, no Edward III claiming to be King of France, no 100 Years' War as history knows it. Whatever wars France fights in the 14th century, they're fighting against someone else, because the English aren't in the ring at all. Instead, England's entire orientation for the medieval period points north and east, instead of south. Its natural political partners and rivals are Denmark, Norway, and the Norse settlements in Ireland, Scotland's Northern Isles, and eventually Iceland and Greenland, not France and the Low Countries. You could easily see something like a permanent or semi-permanent political union between an England that's culturally Scandinavian and the actual Scandinavian kingdoms, similar to the real historical Kalmar Union that briefly tied Denmark, Norway, and Sweden together in the 14th century, except with Britain added to the mix as the wealthiest member instead of an occasional conquest target. And that gets us to exploration, because this is the part I find genuinely fascinating. Historically, Norse sailors reached North America around the year 1000, Leif Erikson and the settlement at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland. And it came to essentially nothing, a couple of failed colonies that got abandoned within a few years because Greenland and Iceland simply didn't have the population or resources to support a colonial project that far from home. Now put England, one of the wealthiest and most populous regions in Northern Europe, inside that same Norse cultural and political network with direct maritime routes already established through Norse Britain to Norse Iceland to Norse Greenland to Vinland. Suddenly, the colonial project in North America isn't being run out of a Greenlandic settlement of a few hundred people. It's being run, or at least resourced, out of a kingdom with real cities, real surplus grain, real timber, and a navy. I'm not saying you get a fully colonized eastern seaboard by the year 1200, that's a stretch even for alternate history. But you get something historically we never had, a genuinely sustained reason to keep the Vinland route open and centuries head start on transatlantic contact before anyone in Genoa or Lisbon has even drawn the maps that will eventually send Columbus the other way around, which then reshapes the entire age of exploration on the other side of the equation. If Norse Britain already has working knowledge of land across the Atlantic centuries before 1492, the entire Iberian sprint to find the western route to Asia looks different because the geography isn't a mystery anyone's racing to solve. It's a known quantity that one culture has been quietly sitting on for half a millennium. Spain and Portugal still push south around Africa, but the Western Ocean isn't the same blank space it was for Columbus. It's somebody else's fishing grounds and timber colonies. Let's come back to the island itself for a second, because I don't want to lose the human thread in all this geopolitics. A permanent Norse conquest means the actual texture of daily life on this island changes in ways that go well beyond kings and treaties. Place names shift harder toward Norse patterns across the whole country instead of just the old Danelaw counties, so instead of a scattering of towns ending in By and Thorpe concentrated in Yorkshire and the East Midlands, the way we actually see today, you'd get that pattern everywhere. Sussex, Kent, Cornwall, all of it. Farming structures shift because Norse land holding customs, particularly around inheritance and the status of free farmers called carls, were meaningfully different from the manorial systems that came to dominate under Norman feudalism. You could end up with a rural England where a broader class of free land-holding farmers persists for centuries instead of being pressed down into feudal tenancy simply because the legal architecture that produced Norman-style feudalism in our timeline never gets imported. And here's the ironic twist buried in the middle of all this: a Norse Britain that never loses to the Anglo-Saxons and then never gets conquered by the Normans either, ends up looking in some ways more institutionally similar to modern democratic government earlier than our actual history did because it inherits Scandinavia's assembly culture instead of France's feudal one. The road to something like parliamentary representation might run through the Thing Assembly instead of through barons, cornering King John into signing Magna Carta in 1215, an event that, again, simply cannot happen in this timeline because there is no King John, no Plantagenet dynasty, and no Angevin empire to produce the specific baronial grievances that forced that document into existence in the first place. So where does that leave the world by, say, the year 1500? You have an island kingdom that speaks a North Germanic language, governs through assembly traditions closer to Iceland's Althing than to French-style feudal monarchy, sits at the center of a North Atlantic and North Sea political network stretching from Denmark to Greenland and possibly Vinland, and has never fought a war over the French throne because it was never entangled in French dynastic politics to begin with. Whether that kingdom becomes something like the historical British Empire is genuinely an open question, because the entire raw material of that empire, the maritime law, the joint stock company, the specific fusion of parliamentary sovereignty and naval power that let a relatively small island project force across the entire globe, all of that grew out of a very particular sequence of Tudor, Stuart and Hanoverian institutions that never exist in this world at all. You might get a smaller, more regional North Atlantic trading power instead of a planet-spanning empire. Or you might get something stranger and earlier, a transatlantic Norse-English network reaching North America 500 years ahead of schedule, with consequences for the indigenous peoples of that continent that are honestly too large and too dark to responsibly speculate about in the back half of a video that started with a joke about horned helmets. What I keep coming back to, working through this one, is how much of what people call English identity turns out to be downstream of exactly one battle, fought by exactly one king, who by his own admission was hiding in a swamp a few months earlier with nothing guaranteed. Alfred wins at Edington, and the entire subsequent architecture of English language, English law, English monarchy, French entanglement, and eventually global empire gets built on that foundation. Alfred loses, and all of it, every piece, gets rebuilt on a completely different foundation, one that was sitting right there the whole time, one island over, waiting. That's the version of England that almost happened. Not conquered and expelled the way the story gets told. Conquered and never let go.